My name is Greg Johnson. I'm head of Archives and Special Collections at the University of Mississippi. Let me just dive right in, because I don't want us to be, until the wee hours of the morning before the film starts. I have a tendency to run on. So while tonight's film, The Songcatcher, is a work of fiction, it is inspired by very real events that happened in the first decades of the 20th century. It is not related to this book by Sharon McCrum that came out basically the same year that the movie Songcatcher came out, so that could be a little confusing, and they deal with similar subject matter. Shandi tells me that book is really good, by the way. I've not read it, so she gives it a thumbs up. Despite the film's legal disclaimers that all depictions of people, places, and events are purely fictional and any similarities are just coincidences, it is pretty clear that there are two inspirations for the film's main character. One is Olive Dame Campbell, co-founder of the John C. Campbell Folk School in North Carolina. I have several friends who both present there and have attended workshops on different music making, like Celtic harp, doing different types of arts and crafts, visual arts. That is her on the right with John Jacob Niles, I'll talk about in a moment. Another inspiration for the main character is Dorothy Scarborough. She was a folklorist from Texas who spent many years collecting folk songs in Appalachia. She called herself a songcatcher. One of the things she feared was that radio was threatening regional folk music's survival. In some ways, she's correct. Get in your car, just turn the dial on the radio station when you're driving from here all the way to, the Pacific Northwest. You're going to hear the same songs over and over. Every third song is going to be a Taylor Swift one, I'm sure. Nothing wrong with that, but it's a homogenization of culture that's been happening, and she feared that, so she went out and really wanted to collect these songs before she felt they would disappear. So I want to spend just a little bit of time before we start the film talking about some important song collectors in America, and pay some special attention to some folk music collected here in Mississippi. All right, so first, make sure we're on the same page. What is folk music? There are a lot of definitions. Some are just music, usually of simple character and anonymous authorship, handed down among common people by oral tradition. Music by known composers that has become part of the folk tradition of a country or a region. Pete Seeger called it non-commercial people's music. Music originating among the common people of a nation or region and spread about or passed down orally, often with considerable variation. And also contemporary music in the style of traditional folk music. So a lot of people that are making music hitting the waves in the folk charts, they're often newly composed music, but it's in the style of some of these earlier things, often fused with other musical traditions. When we're thinking about folk music, when you hear the words folk music, it often conjures up images of like Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, and for very good reason. They were major figures in the folk revival that took place in the middle of the 20th century. There was a rise in nationalism following World War II that caused a lot of Americans to want to learn about our own roots, our own cultural origins on many levels. There was also a nostalgia for the past, especially with the fast pace of modernity leading to massive war casualties and even the prospect of total annihilation. Since the mid-19th century, American folklorists and musicologists, or even more specialized ethnomusicologists, have been collecting folk music and releasing it to the world through books and later recordings. The Library of Congress created a American folk song division in 1928. One of the most important folk song collectors was Francis James Child. He was born in Boston in 1825. He was a professor of rhetoric and oratory at Harvard University. He would become Harvard's first professor of English in 1876. He's primarily known for collecting a trove of English and Scottish ballads, which are now collectively referred to as the Child Ballads, for the longest time, I kept hearing these references to child ballads, and I thought they were referring to like kids' music, like kids' song. I didn't know what this was until years ago, and I like, oh, it's named after this collector. He collected over 305 ballads, first printed, it was Child's 2,500-page book, The English and Scottish Popular Ballads. He wasn't the first person in America collecting folk ballads, but the academic rigor of his research and the size of the works he collected sets the child ballads apart as really one of the most important collections in the genre. A lot of recordings of these child ballads have been made over the years. Ewan McCall, many others. Joan Baez, a number of she's recorded a number of these child ballads. I mean, Henry Martin, the House Carpenter, Geordie, Mattie Groves, those are all child ballads that appear on these albums. More recently, Anais Mitchell, this is over 10 years ago now, but this album, it's all child ballads, her versions of those. So another very important folk collector in America was Frances Dinsmore. She lived 1867 to 1957. She was from Red Wing, Minnesota. She began work with the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology in 1907. Throughout the course of her career, she recorded over 3,500 songs. She even recorded 50 wax cylinders in Mississippi, Philadelphia, the Bogchito, and near the Pearl River. The photo on the right, that's her with Mountain Chief. That's not her recording. She's actually playing back some cylinders. He was in Washington, D.C. for another event and stopped by the Smithsonian. And so she pulled out some of these wax cylinder recordings she made and was playing them back, and he was basically telling what these songs were about. There's just a short clip I'm going to play about one of her pieces. I guess the audio is not coming out on this one, Matt. And it's okay. Yeah, I guess the audio feed's not coming through here. I'm not sure. And it's okay, we can...
the feed is,
Yeah, it's okay. I'll skip it. Later on, if you're interested in these, I can give you some of these examples. So another very important ballad and folk song collector was John Jacob Niles. He was born in Louisville, Kentucky in 1892. Niles went all over Appalachia collecting folk songs. On these trips, he would go into towns and ask people to sing some of the old songs that they knew. He would transcribe the words and the melody to these songs, and later he published them in collections of folk songs that he gathered from around the country. One of the really interesting things found by Niles and other folk song collectors, that quite a few of the songs that Francis Child had collected, and others, songs from Ireland and Scotland and England, had survived in the United States. In some cases, the American versions of these songs were quite similar in lyrical and melodic content to those earlier versions. In other cases, the words or the melodies had changed considerably. It's very much like that game Telephone, where I whisper in your ear, and then by the time it gets to the back, it's changed maybe to a completely new sentence. Just a few, there's a term for these misunderstood lyrics, mondegreen. There was a folklorist once, and she heard this song, and she thought they were saying, the song said, "My lady mondegreen," but the song said, "and laid him on the green." So the Eurythmics song, that's often misunderstood. Jimi Hendrix's song, Purple Rain, it's "Excuse me while I kiss the sky," not "kiss this guy," as some people think he's saying. Some people think it's "knock, knock, knocking on Kevin's door." I don't know. "Hold Me Closer, Tony Danza." It's a Tiny Dancer. And this one, apparently this is a very common one. My dad, for the longest time, thought Bad Moon Rising was saying "There's a bathroom on the right," which is a hilarious misunderstanding. All right, some other important folk song collectors. John and Ruby Lomax. They were very important collectors in the first half of the 20th century. They helped bring the music of Leadbelly to a much wider audience. They also recorded a lot of cowboy songs. At one cattlemen's convention, one of the person at the main guy at the convention, he said, "There's a man named Lomax here who wants to know if anyone knows some of the old cowboy songs." Why, everybody knows those damn fool songs, and only a bigger damn fool would try to collect them. I vote we adjourn to the bar. So that gives you a little sense of what a lot of people's perception, like, why does anybody want to collect these folk songs? I mean, they're just common songs. Everybody knows them. Well, as we've seen, not everybody knows these things. I mean, they will die out and disappear if it wasn't for the collecting efforts of a lot of people like we're talking about here. Ruby Lomax, she was very important on these. She wrote out most of the field notes on these recording expeditions. Of course, it's almost always the men that get the credit, even though she's doing all the work behind the scenes and not getting the credit. The books always have John Lomax's name on it. Not her. I mean, you'll see her thanked in the foreword. Their son, Alan Lomax, is even more famous. He really carried on his parents' folk music collecting tradition. He went all around the world collecting folk songs and folk music of different types for the Library of Congress and others. He captured Italian bagpipe music and much more. Though he's most famous for first recording Muddy Waters. He recorded Mississippi Fred McDowell, Other Turner, a lot of people here in Mississippi. What he's done for collecting folk music is just immeasurable. He's put out a lot. There are many editions of collected folk song books and sound recordings he made. Other people, like, though he's known primarily for his poetry, Carl Sandburg collected hundreds of folk songs and published those. Author Zora Neale Hurston, she was also a folklorist. She served as Alan Lomax's local guide on his recording sessions in Florida. So she knew a lot of these performers and took him around to people that he thought should be recorded. She even there's some audio recordings of her singing some folk songs that she collected as well. Another really important person is John Wesley Work III. So he worked at Fisk University. He kind of initiated a huge study that was done with Alan Lomax in the Library of Congress. So several Fisk University professors and graduate students, along with Alan Lomax, did a study in Coahoma County, Mississippi, I think in 1941 and 42. And they went around just collecting folk songs, interviewing people in and around Clarksdale about what music they listened to, who they were influenced by. One of the grad students wrote down the titles of every song on the jukeboxes there. It's pretty fascinating because a lot of early writings about blues, they write about the Mississippi Delta as being this isolated backwater, not in contact with the rest of the world. Those jukeboxes, when they looked at those, they had all of these popular songs that were popular everywhere in the U.S. So the Delta was just as connected as any other place. They shattered a lot of those myths with that study. Other important collectors. This is Kenneth Goldstein. He was the first professor of folklore at the University of Pennsylvania. He was one of Bill Ferris's advisors when Bill Ferris was in college. And that's one of the reasons we have his collection here at the University of Mississippi. He did a lot of work collecting folk songs in Scotland, Aberdeenshire, and some other areas there, all throughout New England and up into Newfoundland and Labrador, Nova Scotia. He was looking at a lot of Anglo-Celtic origins of American folk songs. This is one of the albums he produced, The Unfortunate Rake. It traces all of these variations and origins of, St. James Infirmary, all of these. There are so many variations that he traced back hundreds of years. He also produced a lot of blues recordings, early recordings. These are albums he helped produce at Stinson, Prestige, Bluesville, some of these labels. At the time when 78 RPMs were transitioning to LPs, right in that moment. So he did a lot of, these are recordings he made. He did the first recordings of Reverend Gary Davis, for instance. He also thought, he was one of the first people to really start writing liner notes for folk music recordings. He thought it was a disservice because he was looking at these classical music albums where you could see a work by Bach, for instance, read all about the history of the piece, what inspired Bach, learn about how he composed it. And he said, we need to do the same for folk music. There's so much rich history behind these songs. All right, so let's talk another folk song collector much closer to home. So this guy, this is Howard Odom. He was a student here at the University of Mississippi in the first decade of the 20th century. He was studying classics, and he took a sociology course and learned about some folk music traditions and got just fascinated by it. He went around Lafayette County and recorded all these examples of black folk music in this county, recorded them onto wax cylinders. And he was working with his research partner was Guy Johnson from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. As far as we know, they wrote down everything they got for their studies, and the cylinders no longer exist. This would have been the holy grail of blues, because what they describe and some of the content of what the songs were about and the structure of them, sounds like they were very much describing some early blues or prototype of blues songs. And those recordings don't exist. This would have been years before commercial blues recordings came out. So just talking about wax cylinders briefly. If you ever hear any of these digitized versions of these old cylinders, it sounds a little strident. It's because this is all pre-electrical recording processes. So you can see this in this photo, an example of all these people are getting as close as they can to this horn, and they're playing extremely loudly. In fact, you can see some of these violins. These are called Stroh violins. They have an extra, like a metal horn that comes out of the violin to make it even louder. It sounds a little rough, but it projects, and that's what you needed. Everybody had to shout. Now, this is like singers. They sing about this loud all the time into a mic. No, you can't sing that softly. You've got to project. Back in the day. I'll skip this since we're not having, this was a video showing a demonstration of my friend Martin Fisher, who works at Middle Tennessee State University. He does a lot of demonstrations of wax cylinder recordings. It's pretty cool. And so a lot of this recording, all this technology came out from, when Thomas Edison invented the process to record and play back audio in 1877. He wasn't the first person to record audio, though. Edward Léon Scott de Martinville, a French inventor, invented the process to record audio in 1857, 20 years before Edison did. But he had no way to play these back. He created this thing called a phonotogram, and that's his patent drawing there. It basically etched the sound wave into a piece of paper with soot on it. But there was no way to drop a needle into that. It was too thin. Luckily, about 10 years ago, brilliant audio engineers took high-resolution images of those phonotograms from the French National Archive, and converted that into a sound wave. So look up firstsounds.org, and you can hear some of these early recordings as early back as 1860. So we have audio before the American Civil War, which is insane. Also close to home is Arthur Palmer Hudson. So he taught at the University of Mississippi. He was born in 1892, the same year as John Jacob Niles. He was from Attala County in Mississippi. He received his bachelor's of science right here at the University of Mississippi in 1913, and then later a master's in 1920. He was the principal at Gulfport High School and later served as superintendent of schools in Oxford. He taught in the English department here at the university. He got interested in folklore when he was taking classes here. So he went on to collect folk songs from all over Mississippi, several important works of his that came out. So he had a lot of his students in his classes go out and find their grandparents, some of the oldest people they knew, and he asked them to sing the old songs that they knew. This is a transcript of Barbara Allen, the folk song, This was done by one of his students who wrote it out from the singing of Mrs. Theodosia Bonnet Long in Saltillo, Mississippi. He and his students documented at least 16 versions of Barbara Allen all over Mississippi. Ethnomusicologist Julia Bishop and librarian folklorist Steve Rood have written that Barbara Allen is far and away the most widely collected song in the English language, equally popular in England, Scotland, and Ireland, and with hundreds of versions collected over the years in North America. The earliest mention of the song Barbara Allen comes from January 2nd, 1966 entry in Samuel Pepys' diary. He wrote, "Above all, my dear Mrs. Knipp, with whom I sang, and in perfect pleasure I was to hear her sing, and especially her little Scotch song of Barbary Allen." This song appears on a number of broadsides that are part of the Kenneth Goldstein collection that we have here in the archive. These are scans of some of those that we've digitized and put online. And you can find all of these online. In fact, just a few years ago, before she passed away, Kenneth Goldstein's daughter, Rhoda Goldstein, posted on Facebook. She said, told a little anecdote about her dad. She said, when he made recordings in Newfoundland and Labrador, she said he would always go in and test the tape recorder before each recording session, and every time he would sing a phrase or two of Barbara Allen to make sure the recorder was working. These are a lot of different versions of this song. There's so many variants of this song. In some, Barbara Allen becomes Barbara Ellen or Barbary Ellen. There are a lot of versions of this. Some versions describe Martinmas Day. Those are the earliest versions of it. It's also known as St. Martin's Day. It usually occurs around November 11th. There are other versions describe beginning in May or in Scarlet Town or Charlotte Town. Many variations on this. John Jacob Niles, who I talked about earlier, he writes about the song. He says, "I have sung this ballad for nigh on to 60 years, and I have never found it to fail to hold the listeners." Niles describes an early encounter with this song on one of his song collecting trips. Quote, "On Punchin Camp Creek in Kentucky in the autumn of 1933, I encountered a young man named Carter Sizemore. His clothes were faded and tattered, but they were washed clean and bright. He had a guitar tied on his back, and he carried a small poke which contained all his otherworldly goods, and he was heading out. I unlimbered my dulcimer, and he untied his guitar, and there, in the warm sun of an Indian summer afternoon, we sang for one another. He was fascinated with me, and I was fascinated with him. He had never seen a man-person wearing city clothes who could sing in a country way, and I had never seen so unspoiled a type as Carter Sizemore. He said he was going to join the Army at the very first recruiting station." Niles goes on a bit, and then he writes about one of the songs that Carter Sizemore sang. "I admired his Barbary Ellen enormously, and before he left, he offered me the loan of 6 verses I needed so sorely. With the additional verses, my Barbary Ellen was a complete tragedy in 16 verses. We shook hands, I put my dulcimer back into its oilcloth bag, and he tied his guitar onto his back." We don't have the audio working here right now, so I apologize for this. So I had several variants of this I was going to play. This is Lucy Stewart from Aberdeenshire, Scotland. This was a version that was recorded by Kenneth Goldstein. And she has a lot of my Barbary Ellen O. That's that O phrase you keep hearing repeated, and a lot of dialects from Scotland and Ireland sometimes. This is Jean Ritchie. She has a beautiful version. Joan Baez has a great version. This guy, Bob Dylan, great version of the song. Let me just quickly talk about a few more collectors that did work in Mississippi. So Abbott Ferris and Herbert Alpert, a lot of folk collecting music in Mississippi as part of the WPA, Works Progress Administration. They were, finding jobs for people and many fields of work. And some of that was collecting folk music from around the country, and they were stationed in Mississippi. Abbott Ferris is from Mississippi. Herbert Halpert, not to be confused with Herb Alpert in the Tijuana Brass. This is a different guy. He was a folklorist at Memorial University in Newfoundland, where actually Kenneth Goldstein taught for some time. That's Herb Halpert. He called it his sound wagon. He had all of his recording gear in there. They would have these generators that they would have run with a long cable. They'd try to run it as far away as possible so the sound of the generator wasn't messing up the recording. But they went all over the state. This one, just since we don't have the audio, just YouTube this recording. The women on the right, Catherine and Christine Shipp, they made the first recording that they recorded of the song Sea Lion Woman, recorded in Byhalia in 1939. That song was later covered by Nina Simone as Sea Lion Woman. But when you look at the lyrics, it's not clear that it was about some sort of sea lion or Selkie type figure or something like that. There were a lot of people thought that it was when people were disembarking in ports like New Orleans and others, there'd be lines of women, sometimes prostitutes, offering their wares, and it was called the Sea Line. Look and see what services they have to offer, and I'll let your imagination fill in the rest. They also did a lot of recordings for these WPA recordings that came out in this album that was produced by the Mississippi Department of Archives and History and worked on with people from the Center for the Study of Southern Culture here on campus. Tom Rankin did some writings on that years ago, some of the liner notes. Great Big Yam Potatoes, which is the name of one of the fiddle tunes they recorded. And they recorded a lot of fiddle players from all over the state. This guy, Stephen Tucker, great fiddle player, recorded at then Meridian Community College. I actually got my first 2 years of college at Meridian Community College. They also recorded this guy, John Alexander Brown in Iuka in Tishomingo County. He came in like he was out in the field plowing whenever he showed up, and he just left his plow right there, came in, played fiddle a little bit, and then ran back out to the field. Unlike this other guy who was recorded the same day, same time, who was wearing his Sunday best, John Hatcher here. These songs are great. Those of you that want to hear these later, just talk to me. I'll make sure you can hear the audio. Other fiddle players down in Meridian. I'll skip that. Anyway, we're doing a lot of work right now. I received a very large grant through the National Historical Publications and Records Commission this past year to digitize a lot of our analog, non-commercial audio-visual holdings, 16mm film, Super 8 film, VHS, U-matic, beta tapes, open-reel audio tapes of different sizes. And so this is a 3-year grant, and Wednesday of this week, everything is shipping out to be digitized by this really good company. So in about 3 years or so, we're going to be making a lot of these resources, including a lot of folk song recordings from different collectors available to the public. So stay tuned. And thank you for your attention today. And we're about to switch things back over and watch a really, really cool film, Songcatcher. So give us a few minutes to change over the tech. Thanks.